And
It'll give you a countdown.
hello, everybody, and welcome to the
Not yet.
Okay. And go.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the IAB and PwC half year 2017 and Q2 2017 Internet Ad Revenue Report. We have an exciting agenda for today. We are going to be walking through the results of the half year report and the Q2 Internet Ad Revenue Report. And just as a brief intro, my name is Christina Striginis. I'm the research director here at the IAB, and I just wanted to give a few housekeeping notes before we begin. I wanted to mention up front that the Internet Ad Revenue Report and the webinars that you're about to see are going to be available for download immediately after the webinar ends at noon. And you can find those reports on the site at iab.com/ad-revenue-report. So we're going to walk through the presentations, and then after the presentations, we'll have Q&A from reporters, followed by questions from our members. So please type your questions into the chat box on BlueJeans in the user interface at any time during the presentations. We'll create a queue, and we will answer as many of these questions as possible following the presentations. If you still have any questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to us. You can email, reporters can email Laura Goldberg at laura.goldberg, Goldberg, @iab.com. And IAB members can contact me, Christina Striginis, at Christina with a K, Kristina, @iab.com. So today we're going to be covering the report in 3 parts. The first part will be a general overview of the top line numbers by Chris Kist, SVP and CMO at the IAB, and me, Christina Striginis, IAB's research director. The second part will be a detailed analysis of the findings by David Silverman, who's a partner at PwC. And finally, the third part is going to be a presentation from our guest speaker that goes beyond the numbers in the report and looks at the local advertising market. And this is called Snapshot SMB Ad Spending. And our guest speaker today is Gordon Borrell, CEO and founder of Borrell Associates. As a quick brief bio on Gordon Borrell, he's the CEO and founder of Borrell Associates. And in case anyone is not familiar with Borrell Associates, they are the leading authority on local ad revenue and local ad spending. So we're really excited to hear what Gordon has to say in his perspective on the local market and how that fits into the overall general ad revenue numbers. So we're very happy to have Gordon with us here today. So now let's move on to the exciting results, beginning with Chris.
Awesome. Thanks, Christina. There we go. All right. So to begin with, the very top line number in the first half of 2017, we saw internet digital ad revenue grow to $40 billion. That's 22% growth from the same period last year. That 22% is actually the largest first half to first half growth that we've seen since 2011. Putting that into the context of other media, we can see the substantial jump at the very top. We see some growth in broadcast and cable TV at somewhat smaller rates, and then challenges a bit throughout the rest of the ecosystem. With the size of the growth on the internet side, this does suggest that something beyond share shift is happening, and we're going to return to that idea shortly. But let's dive first more deeply into the digital revenue numbers themselves. So as you can see, from first half 2016 to first half 2017, the overall growth is marked by a significant growth within mobile and its contribution to the total number. If some of you might recall back to our full year 2016 report, mobile accounted for just over half of the total revenue for 2016, and we see that trend expanding into the first half of 2017. Looking at mobile in isolation, looking to see how it's grown, it's interesting to note that in half year 2017, mobile's portion for the first half of 2017 is larger than it was for the entirety of full year 2015, just 2 short years ago, and growth looks poised to continue. Looking at specific formats, we see growth across all the different format types that we track. Search up 18% to 19.1 billion. It makes up about 48% of the total internet ad revenue. Banner is a substantial piece, still at 31%. That's 25% growth year over year at 12.4 billion. Video remains a very strong growth medium and extremely important. 13% of the total revenue, up 36% to 5.2 billion. And last but by no means least, audio, which is a smaller slice at 2%, but is showing extremely strong growth. That's up 42% year over year to 603 million. Shifting over to mobile specifically, we can see that mobile accounts for at least half of all of these different formats. Mobile search ad revenue up 30% to 9.9 billion. Banners up 37% to 8 billion. Mobile video, mobile accounting for half of video revenue, that's up 65% to 2.6 billion. And in audio, we really see the importance of mobile for that format. 74% of its revenue is mobile. That's up 32%, or that the number is up to 448 million. That's up 32% year over year. Looking at a couple other formats, social continues to grow and be a very important format, up to 9.5 billion for the first half of 2017. Video, as mentioned, very, very strong growth, 36% up to $5.2 billion. And then drilling into audio again, 42% growth, 600 million. Still small, but very mighty and growing very, very quickly. So at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Christina, who will walk through a focus on second quarter's numbers in particular.
Great. Perfect. Thanks so much, Chris. And here we are on the slide. So looking at Q2 revenue specifically, we see that Q2 2017 numbers compared to Q2 2016, similarly to the half-year numbers, are up by 23%, and that's a growth from $16.9 billion to $20.7 billion just in Q2 alone. And as you can see, compared to Nielsen's calculations, Nielsen calculates that total media revenues have actually decreased and are actually down by 3% from Q2 to Q2. And this is in large part fueled by the growth of mobile ad revenue, which is, of course, reflecting the overall consumer trend of mobile device use, 2/3 of which is now all internet time is now spent on a mobile device. You can find out more about that by looking at the consumer usage trend reports on the IAB site. So again, comparatively, we see 23% growth year over year in all digital revenue. And we compare that to total media, and we see 3% decrease. Looking more closely at these numbers from Nielsen, who so graciously provided these numbers to us, if we look at these numbers in comparison, again, look at broadcast TV. It's up 1% to about 11.6 billion in Q2 17. Cable TV is actually down by 1% to 6.4 billion in Q2 17. And newspapers are down 11% to 2 billion. And both radio and magazine are down by 10 percentage points from just a year ago in Q2. So we see, again, really strong growth in digital from every aspect of digital compared to the growth trends of traditional media. Now, looking at the CPM monthly trend, with looking at this data, which is again provided to us by Squad Web Costs, we see that over the year that CPMs have increased. We see that video has gone up to an average of $24.51 CPM, and that's it's gone up to 5 percentage points over the year. And comparatively, we see that display is also up, and it is increased by 6 percentage points to about 1460 as the average CPM. And then looking at the next slide, when we look at the comparisons of the different categories, we can see that CPMs, across the board are pretty consistent. They're, most of the categories are up slightly. A couple of them are down slightly, but overall we see healthy CPMs throughout the industry throughout the year. So with that, I want to pass the clicker back to Chris Kist, who will talk about the local and SMB ad spend hypothesis.
Indeed, thanks, Christina. So the origin of this hypothesis that we'd like to present today is that we have been seeing for a while now double-digit growth in internet ad revenues year over year over year. And the report has done a great job of demonstrating that is happening, but we feel like we need to have a better understanding of why and how it's happening. And so we're looking for ways to dimensionalize this report so we can have a bit higher resolution, a better understanding of the dynamics of internet ad revenue and how it's growing and why it's growing so much more rapidly than we see with other media. So the hypothesis that we have landed on is that it's not so much, the growth in digital is not so much about an expansion or a reallocation of existing national ad revenue budgets, but that what we're seeing is an influx of smaller and medium-sized businesses at the local level engaging in the digital marketplace. So we're going to take a couple slides just to walk through this hypothesis so you can see what our logic is and so what the platform is that we're going to use to evolve this report moving forward. So the first sort of starting point is that growth is challenging at the national advertiser level. The advertisers themselves are not seeing significant growth. At our joint ANA 4A's IAB board meeting, Mark Pritchard of P&G shared with us a slide that showed that more than half of the Fortune 500 actually had revenue declines in 2016 at an average decline of about 9%. In conjunction with that, we ourselves, as well as many others, have been looking at data from the IRS and elsewhere to understand how spending growth is occurring among the largest companies. Brian Weezer's done a lot of really great work here. And we see that ad spend growth rates are small to begin with, 2.8% per company in 2013, which is the most current IRS data. But among the largest companies, those with business receipts over $250 million, it's an even more anemic growth rate of 1.2%. And indeed, as we see the revenue numbers earlier in the deck, we see that aside from digital, we're not seeing just simply enough movement of money to be able to account for all the growth that we're seeing. So what is happening? Well, we wanted to explore other places that money could be coming from, and we landed on this idea that the small and local small and medium-sized business population in this country is actively engaged in digital advertising. We spoke with our friends at Burrell, who estimate that there's something along the order of 9 million small and medium-sized businesses. That's if you define that as businesses that generate 50 million or less a year in revenue annually. And a note on definitions, there is not a clear, single, unambiguous view of this. The definitions matter enormously, and that's one of the things that we're going to need to be thinking about to bring some to be as consistent as we can be in how we're defining all these things. But if we start from a definition of 50 million or less in revenue, there's somewhere around 9 million of them. Somewhere around 75% or more are buying digital advertising. That puts the market roughly at 6.8 million advertisers, which is an enormous number relative to the number of big national advertisers there are out there. And we see that these SMBs who are buying digital advertising are extremely engaged. 80% of them are saying that they buy advertising via self-service platforms, that'd be Facebook, Twitter, Snap, Yelp, those sorts of entities. 15% say they're buying programmatically, and 45% say they're buying SEM. It's worth noting that these particular numbers are dependent on the way Burrell defines these two categories. It's a little different than we would sort of from the inside baseball perspective of the industry. But if you go in and look at the noise a little bit and kind of put these together, you begin to get sort of in the north of 50% are engaged in something that we on the inside call programmatic. That's consistent with what we've seen from other estimates. So a lot of activity there. And perhaps the most important and exciting bit is that 63% of these small and medium-sized businesses say they expect to increase their digital spend in the coming 12 months, and only something like 3% are expecting to see a decline. So it is a market that's active and that is growing. And this suggests to us that there's a way forward to understand this better, because as I said, we've seen consistent growth in digital advertising revenue year over year, but there appears to be insufficient growth among large national advertisers to fully account for that growth. There is a large and growing cohort of small and medium-sized businesses who are engaged in digital advertising. Their budgets are of necessity smaller, but there are a lot of them, and such there is reason to believe that collectively they're injecting significant dollar volume into the digital advertising ecosystem. And so to better understand this cohort will allow for everyone in the ecosystem to build things better to be able to serve them and tap into this value, as well as create better value for what's a very important constituency. So this is the logic behind the approach we're going to be taking to look at small and medium-sized businesses and their role in digital marketing at a higher resolution than we have previously. But that is for the future. To recap quickly the key takeaways for today's report, digital ad spending continues to rise across all formats. Banner is up 25%, video is up 36%. We're seeing strong growth across mobile, and the shift to mobile, it's more than half of digital ad revenue in the first half of this year. The revenue itself is up 40% to about $22 billion. It's more than half of all of the major formats we track, and it's an extremely important platform, particularly for banner and for audio revenue. Search is still growing, a little bit smaller. It's 18% growth, but it represents 48% of the total revenue, down slightly in terms of share, but still extremely important. Social itself is up as well, 37% to $9.5 billion. And that represents our quick walkthrough. I'm going to hand it over to David Silverman, a partner at PwC, to give you the nitty-gritty details of the numbers.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the IAB. So I'm going to cover in the next few minutes basically our survey methodology. I will probably end up reiterating just some of the key trends that Chris and Christina pointed out regarding the first 6 months of the year, impacts from mobile, the advertising formats, what we're seeing on social media and audio, as well as pricing models. I'll first just describe our survey methodology. Our methodology is consistent with how we've approached this in the past, with some minor tweaks as we continually deal with the changes to the industry. The way in which we put this report together is different from what other estimates of the industry utilize, in that we first start with a survey of industry participants. And those that participate, the information is maintained confidentially, and we make sure that no individual company information is ever discussed in the survey. We start with a database of companies that sell online advertising, and we update this listing of companies every year. That is key to the survey, in that the industry is constantly changing and there are new players coming and going. So we need to make sure that our listing is accurate. We, of course, leverage the IAB membership. We then survey the leading companies within the industry, asking them to respond to a whole host of quantitative questions regarding their activity during the period. And for companies that do not participate, we then supplement it with publicly available information, mostly information that we obtain from 10Ks, 10Qs, and press releases. But where necessary, we also use other public sources and make conservative estimates where necessary. And then we report on it twice a year, this, of course, being our first report for 2017 on the half year. As Chris mentioned, Just advance the slides here. As Chris mentioned, there was a 22.6% increase in the first half of the year, $7.1 billion increase, going up to 40.1 million, and a 23.1% increase for Q2 over the prior year Q2, increasing $3.9 billion, or 23.1%. And then lastly, there was a 7.4% increase between Q1 and Q2, roughly a $1.4 billion increase. So these are these increases, I think, are now fairly commonplace in this industry. And this slide I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on is this slide, which is the history of our survey from 1996 to 2017. And what's unique about this is that we've seen double-digit growth in every quarter since Q2 of 2010. Not the fact that we're seeing double-digit growth quarter after quarter, but it's been consistent for a number of years now. The other thing that I've identified, just going back to our prior reports, is over the past 10 years, or 40 quarters, 34 of them have had double-digit growth, and 18 of them, almost half of them, have had growth that was at least 20%. If you look 10 years back, the second quarter was about $5 billion, and the first half of the year, 10 years ago, was about $10 billion. So the industry has quadrupled in size in 10 years. Very significant. And what's unique, really, to this growth rate is that it's no longer unique. It's been consistent over time. And we view that there are about probably the primary driver of this is the ubiquity of the internet right now, driven by mobile, as Chris and Christina pointed out, the significant growth in mobile, the growth in social, and the growth in video, all playing into one another, each having a piece to do: social impacting mobile, mobile allowing social, and video as well. So they all are interrelated and all are fueling the growth. We look at the full year. We don't actually make an estimate. Apologize, but we're having trouble with this slide deck here. They're seeing it. Okay. Apologize. Just having a little bit of technical issues on the slides, but I think you should be seeing it. When we look at the historical trends between first half of the year and second half of the year, we've noted that over the past 10 years, on average, approximately 53% of the annual revenues for any given year occur in the second half. So if that trend continues, we would expect to see a year in excess of $85 billion. So that would obviously be a new high for the year. We also have tracked the industry concentration over time throughout our survey. And one of the things that we've noticed is that the industry has historically been concentrated. So there's a lot of talk about industry concentration. It is not new in this industry, and quite frankly, it's probably true of most of the media industries. We've noted that over the past 10 or 15 years, the top 10 companies have historically made up between 69 and 75% of the industry revenues. And currently, we're at the top end of that range at about 75%. A few observations. Obviously, the industry is growing rapidly, and many companies are benefiting from that growth. The industry has historically had these concentrations. M&A activity has added to industry concentration. But the biggest factor really is about disruption. It's the company that is disrupting the latest trends that are impacting the industry. And those are the companies that tend to get the biggest gains in market share. And as a result, one of the key things we've seen is that the top 10 companies that make up today's top 10 are very different than the top 10 companies from 10 years ago and 15 years ago. If we looked at the top 10 companies from 10 years ago, those 10 companies, some of which would still be in the top 10, but those 10 companies would make up a significantly lower percentage of the overall ad revenues. And when talking about disruption, mobile has been the biggest disruptor of all. It's enabled advertisers to reach consumers basically anywhere, and it's also allowed consumers to consume content basically anywhere. So that has been a huge shift in the overall ability of advertisers and marketers. The overall share has gone to 54% on mobile devices, and that is up from really a negligible amount prior to 2012. So significant changes within the industry in the last 5 years. And that is why we're seeing a mobile compounded annual growth rate of 76.8% over that time period, which has really helped fuel the 15.4% compounded annual growth rate of the industry over the past 10 years. With respect to ad formats, we look at this across devices. We're not breaking it out on this slide between mobile and desktop. Across devices, search remains the largest category at 47% of the overall market share, which is down a little bit from 49% a year ago. But despite the fact that the share is down, the category has actually increased by about $3 billion, or 18%. Display has increased by $3.9 billion. And when I say display, I'm referring to banner and video. That's been the $3.9 billion increase has been driven by a 35% increase in digital video and a 25% increase in banner. And then lastly, the other category, which has remained constant at about 9%, actually increased by $500 million, or 19%, largely driven by classified and the growth in audio that Chris mentioned previously. Digital video, which I mentioned is one of the drivers of growth, has been growing rapidly. $1.3 billion growth from the prior year half year to $5.2 billion, and is now evenly split across devices, with the mobile growing 65% from the prior year. A real strong indicator that that advertisers are able to reach consumers across devices wherever they're consuming this content. And then I mentioned social media being one of the other main drivers of growth. This is a category that has seen a compounded annual growth rate of 51% over the past 5 years, reached $9.5 billion in the current half year, growing 37% from the prior period. And then lastly, a new category, which is we just started tracking last year. This is, I'll call it, a baby driver of growth. It's still relatively small, but growing quickly. And again, another great indication of how mobile has shifted the dynamics of how digital advertisements can be delivered. While digital audio is available on the desktop for many, many years, the ability to now listen to it mobily is really what's unlocked this growth potential. And we've seen a very strong increase to $600 million, 42% from the prior year, with $450 million of it coming on mobile devices. Lastly, with respect to pricing models, we haven't really seen any significant changes here. Performance-based ads can be consistent around 65%. CPM has gone down slightly from 34 to 33%. We look at it on a longer-term trend. You can see that these rates have kind of settled in that 65% range for performance and the lower 30s for CPM for several years now. And lastly, I'll just mention that our contact information is in the webinar and in the report that will be posted, and we'll be happy to answer questions at the end of the presentations, and I'll turn it back over to Chris.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks, David. I'm going to turn it over to our friend Gordon Burrell at this point, who's going to walk us through a much more detailed view of the small and medium sized ad spending market. Important to note again that methodology matters, and so it's important to understand how the numbers are put together. But we're really appreciative of the time and help they've been thus far, and I'd like to turn it over to Gordon for some learnings.
Thank you, Chris, and everything so far has been really, really interesting. Thank you very much. What I'm going to do over the next maybe 10 or 15 minutes is just go over what we see with SMB spending. You're absolutely right. There is a whole world out there that really hasn't been explored. Welcome to my world. It is the world of a very swampy existence with lots of snail darters and alligators and piranhas and things like that out there. What I'm going to try to do is give you a view of what we see in terms of local advertising. And as Chris said, it's really important that we don't do an apples to apples comparison and just look at someone else's numbers, whether it's eMarketer or Pricewaterhouse or anybody else. All numbers are pretty good if you really understand what the definition is. And I'm going to try to help you understand what our definition is on some of these too, so you can see where these numbers are coming from. What we do as a company, and we've been doing this since 2001, when we saw the internet as a disruptive medium that people were not really going to understand and kind of deny, especially those who were disrupted, the numbers that were coming out of the advertising side of the equation. We initially worked with Greg Stewart when he was with the IAB and with folks from Pricewaterhouse. So we've been doing this for a fairly long time. We conduct the largest surveys of SMBs in the country. We license access to our local ad spending database. You can see it at adspending.com. Lots of companies subscribe to that, buy lots of data from us to kind of see what these SMBs are doing, depending on how they define SMBs. We publish regular insights, and we hold this big annual conference in New York every March. It's the largest gathering of local digital media folks. It's over at the Grand Hyatt. Great conference. You should come. The sources of what you're about to see in terms of the data that we have, in addition to this big annual survey, I'm going to pull some data from our latest annual survey and tell you what these local advertisers are saying and planning to do. But our overall source, the big data set, comes from IRS data. We use DMB and Database USA to take a look at individual businesses by size. We stratify them by number of employees. We buy or steal industry research from NADA or NAIDA, National Association of Realtors, TVBRAB, et cetera. We actually conduct a lot of benchmarking reports for industry associations in terms of digital spending and digital revenue. We have these ongoing SMB surveys, as I mentioned. We conduct a panel of local advertisers every month of about 2,000 local businesses. And we have, and this is kind of the secret ingredients, we've been collecting this since 2001. It's an ad revenue database of 10,000 local entities. So we can look down in any individual local market and see dozens and dozens and dozens of companies and how much they are making in terms of digital advertising. And that's really one big difference in the numbers that we have. One of the things that I wanted to tell you before we began is if I asked you to count the number of trees in this picture and gave you 60 seconds to do it, everybody would come up with somewhere between 60 and 90 trees. But if there were a forest ranger among you, they would say, yeah, probably about 300. And that's our view. We look at the forest from the very murky down to the ground level, and we count all of these saplings, which a lot of people tend to miss. There's so much money being spent in local markets. I'm going to go through a definition of SMBs. I'm going to size SMB ad spending. I'm going to show you who's getting that money and what they're buying and some forecasts that we have. A definition of SMBs really depends on who you are. These are actual client responses when we ask them, how do you define an SMB? So it's kind of all across the board, fewer than 50 employees, under 100 employees, et cetera. The working definition that Chris mentioned was, okay, let's go with businesses with 50 million or less in revenue. There's a roughly 9 million of them. There are 21 million businesses nationwide. So we're talking about a small amount that actually spend money. 75% of them are buying digital ads. So the universe, if you want to use this definition, businesses with 50 million or less in revenue, is about 6.8 million SMBs buying digital advertising. That's US only, by the way. from our survey, and our survey is we make an important distinction, and that is we really only survey businesses that are spending money. The vast majority of those 21 million businesses that the Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics say are out there in the United States, 21 million businesses, vast majority of them don't spend a dime on advertising. They might spend some money on marketing, but they don't buy advertising. So when we survey advertisers, we are only serving those who are actually spending money. And as you can see by this, when we segment them out, 32%, 47% have less than 10 employees. So they tend to be really, really small businesses, and they tend to have been in business a long time, more than 10 years, 76% of them. When we look at their total advertising expenditures, it's pretty significant. It's well beyond what you see corporate or big company advertising expenditures, which tend to be 1 or 2%, unless the business has a significant growth initiative going on. These businesses, on average, local businesses are spending 5.9% of their total gross revenue on advertising. If you look down, and we just said, okay, on average, what do these businesses spend out of their total budget? 22% of a total budget might go to broadcast TV. That's because it's a fairly expensive medium. But look at search engine marketing and social media. We wanted to make the point, and you're going to see this several times throughout this presentation. Search engine marketing and social media are phenomenally popular among these small businesses, yet getting only a total of maybe 12% of their budgets. And it's hard to make generalizations and talk about averages because some are just buying social media and they might spend a little more of their budget. Some are just buying search engine marketing, but still it amounts to fairly small amounts of their money. Many of their digital buys are seen as very low budget, do-it-yourself solutions, such as social media, email, etc. That's why the spending levels generally are still pretty low with a lot of these businesses. Yet most of them, which you'll see in a moment, are spending very large amounts of money on all kinds of advertising. So if we look at what they're spending or what percentage of these businesses are spending on digital, about 76% are spending on digital advertising. 76% of advertisers that are spending money on advertising, the small businesses, are spending money on digital. And when we break it out and see where they're spending it, 63% of them are spending it on social media. This is a phenomenon. It's really just cropped up in the past 3 years. It used to be 3 years ago about 20%, and then it went to 35%, and then this year it went to 63%. So it came up very, very quickly. You also see email marketing and search engine marketing and display or banner advertising up there as well as typical types. I wanted to call attention to one other statistic on this slide, and that is 74% use traditional and digital advertising, and they used it again in 2016 as well. So 3/4 of them are buying digital advertising with traditional advertising. They're combining their campaigns with search engine marketing or social media marketing with direct mail or newspaper advertising or TV advertising, and it actually goes beyond that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So when we look at the spending levels, what we look at is in-market spenders. So any numbers that you tend to see from us when we say local, they're not really SMB, it's just the way we prefer and our clients prefer to define them. They say, okay, tell us any business with a store, a physical location inside our market, whether it's Albuquerque or Raleigh or Timbuktu. We want to know what those businesses are spending on advertising directed to appear within that market. If you segment it that way, of the $315 billion spent on advertising this year, which is our total forecast for all advertising, 38% of it is considered local, or $120 billion. So here's where the numbers get really interesting. Who's getting that money? So for 2017, this is our estimate. Online, 50% of that $120 billion. And you can't really compare anybody else's numbers to someone else. So the PwC numbers don't compare to ours or eMarketers, et cetera, because there are different methodologies here. There's some overlap in what's national and what's local. But when we look at it from businesses physically located within a market and what they're spending to reach consumers or businesses within that market, if they're a B2B company, 50% of that total spending is going to digital. Newspapers and print, this is print advertising, get 9.7%, TV gets 8.2%, radio 7.8%, et cetera, on down the line. So the big significant aha from us is that, wow, about a half of all budgets are being spent on digital advertising. The question is, who's getting all of that money? This is where it gets even more interesting. When we look at all of that money that's spent on digital advertising by local advertisers physically located within a market, directing their spending to businesses or consumers within that market, national digital pure play companies are getting 82%. The piece that people tend to forget are those orange and gray and yellow and blue and green slices right there. These are other local media companies. That amounts to 19% of all digitally spent advertising is going to a traditional media company. And that tends to be the piece that's forgotten because it's actually reported in newspaper numbers or TV numbers. So when Sinclair or Nexstar or Gannett or Tegna or Tribune or the others report their advertising numbers, people assume, well, it's a TV company, those are TV numbers. Anywhere from 6 to 40 or 50% of their total revenues, 40 or 50% of their total ad revenues are coming from digital. It amounted to about $12 billion last year in digital advertising collected by these companies, and they're selling it on their apps, on their websites. Some of them are doing reselling of search engine marketing. Some of them are doing social media management. Granted, a lot of these do not fall into an advertising category because they're services. It's getting really blurry. But the point is they are generating pretty significant amounts of money. The real long tail, as you look at it, is, and what we've done here is collected from 2016 what we could discern to be local US-only revenues, advertising-only revenues of these companies. And you can see that Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Bing, LinkedIn, Twitter, et cetera, at the top of the list. But look at the orange bars. And there seems to be only a few of them because you have to kind of squint. But they begin adding up. Dex Media, 400 million, YP, 1.2 billion. Now they're combined and they have the largest sales force of anybody, about 5,000 local ad sales reps. Gannett, $779 million. That's a newspaper company making $779 million in digital advertising. So these are the pieces that tend to be forgotten. And this tail goes on and on and on. And these are only public companies. There are a lot of private companies that we can't account for. In fact, if you look at the average revenue in any individual market, say Philadelphia or again Albuquerque or Miami, et cetera, the daily newspaper on average makes 2.5 million in digital advertising revenues. Digital pure play companies, these would be Angie's List, Cars.com, Craigslist, Autotrader.com, Yelp, et cetera, Weddings.com, 1.7 million on average. TV stations, 1.1 million on average. The difference is that there are a certain number of competitors in each market. There's only one daily newspaper. There tend to be 3 TV stations. There tend to be 2 or 3 or 4 maybe cable systems in any local market, 4 radio clusters per market. And the digital pure plays, there tend to be 10 or more per market applying those markets. So that's why you see this great disparity in the pure play companies getting 82% of all the digital advertising in the marketplace when it looks like, wow, daily newspapers are getting a lot more. Just to give you a quick idea, Dallas Morning News will have brought in probably a little over 50 million in digital advertising revenue this year. Companies like San Francisco Chronicle, Boston Globe, maybe 20 million. So there's quite a bit, and it all, as I said, adds up. We looked at, I just pulled this chart for you guys, total number of business locations and ordered by the amount they spend on advertising, total local advertising. So automotive sales is the number one category this year at about $7 billion. And auto dealers are spending 58, almost 59% of their total ad revenue on, or their ad spending on digital. And you can see it varies. Look down there at real estate services, the fourth one down, and you can see that of the 5.5 billion that real estate agents basically are spending this year on advertising, 76% of their total budget goes to digital. So it varies by individual categories. So you've got to really be careful in understanding that the rates of spending are very, very different for these companies. Government institutions, which do spend a whole lot of money, they tend to be in the top 10 in any local market. Local government spends educational dollars for the community, are only spending about 32% of their total ad budget in digital. But that's still a significant amount of money. What these local businesses are buying is broken out this way by us. We've broken it in paid search into two different buckets. 51% of all local business spending on digital media, 51% is in paid search. But we've broken it into two buckets because it's a little more, it offers a little more clarity in how we track it. General paid search is what you would expect paid search to be. Listings paid search is anytime someone goes to a site and types in a keyword into a very specific database, cars.com, autotrader, homes.com, Craigslist, etc., that's listings paid search. So these are category verticals that we would also consider paid search because the advertising that appears is based on the search itself. Display advertising, meanwhile, which is basically banner ads, amounts to about 30% of total advertising expenditures. We look at display as mostly sold type of advertising, not really do it yourself all that much, but that's changing, particularly with Facebook playing very heavily in that targeted display category. And a lot of that, of course, is do it yourself. The search category is mostly self-serve. We looked at media effectiveness, and I'm going to go through the next couple of slides pretty quickly here, but these slides are available to you. The IAB has asked, and we said, sure, to allow these slides to be distributed. We rated the effectiveness of different types of media and media formats based on our most recent survey, about 3,500 local businesses that are buying advertising. And you can see that the average score, moderately or better, is a score of 3.0. Social media ranked at the top. And again, that's fairly new phenomenon. Broadcast TV is always ranked pretty high. There's some pretty good strength in that because, hell, it's the last mass medium that exists out there. Search engine marketing is also high. But I guess the point of this chart is not only to show who's at the top of the list and who's at the bottom, but that there is a pretty healthy mix of those blue bars in with the orange bars. Don't count out traditional media. Most agencies are telling us, and some of the larger buyers in the marketplace, that they believe that a mix of digital plus traditional media is the most effective. The spending outlook, and I've just got one more slide, I believe, after this, and we'll wrap up. 63% of all respondents to our survey this year said they plan to use digital advertising, increase their digital advertising expenditures. The number one and number two things they plan to do more of was social media and email. And if you can look at that little 2% bar at the bottom of digital, that's negligible. This is not going to decline anytime soon. The advertisers are in love with digital media. They continue that love affair. They really don't care at the local level about fake news and ad fraud and things like that. It hasn't really gotten to them. They make decisions based on whether something works and whether something worked last week. They're really, really practical. And they don't get spooked all that often about things. They are very practical about how they're making their decisions. They are making their decisions about digital media based on data, and they're making their decisions on traditional media based on gut. So they're definitely looking to a lot of statistics, and they have some real information to say digital media works, and it works pretty well. Meanwhile, I'm sure many of you looked over there to the far left end, newspapers, not good news for the newspaper industry or anything in print, those last three categories, newspapers, yellow pages, and magazines. The cost structure of those in delivering advertising to the community is pretty rough. We are seeing some nice increases in direct mail. It's a very, very efficient medium, and we are seeing some pretty favorable rates coming out of the Postal Service, and there's a lot going on with direct mail and local advertisers. They tend to love that medium. The other thing that I'll tell you just quickly about is that one of the things that you'll see next year is a huge local infusion of digital advertising A lot of people aren't paying attention to and haven't seen. About 1.9 billion is going to come in next year and then disappear a little bit, not all of it, the following year. And it's political advertising. We've been tracking this for quite a number of years, and we're looking at, again, about almost 1.9 billion next year in digital advertising, and it's all local. All elections next year are these midterm elections, and they're local. There are 33 Senate seats up, and there are already nearly 2,000 candidates for them. The PAC money is building up phenomenally. The campaigns and the candidates and everybody else is saying they plan to use a significant amount of social media, search engine marketing, and other digital media. So that's one big thing that will push up our numbers next year. Our forecast for 2018 in terms of local advertising expenditures going to be about 4% overall, and for digital it'll be 3 times that. It'll be a little over 12%. It's a little early to tell exactly what's going to happen. If we're wrong, it'll probably be a little higher. Last thing I'll tell you is that those numbers have been decreasing in terms of the growth rate for the past several years. So it's gotten to a saturation point in terms of the percentage of advertisers who are buying digital. It's a phenomenal number to say that, that 60, 70%, sometimes 90% of a certain advertising segment is buying digital media. But we do think there's significant room for growth in quite a few of the other categories that have not availed themselves all that much of digital media. Last thing I want to tell you is that these folks down at the local level are rookie marketeers. We asked them how many years they've been spending making marketing decisions and how many hours a week they spend making marketing decisions. And then we calculated what percentage of them are novices or apprentices based on the theory that you need 10,000 hours to be a master at something. 72% are novices at marketing, and 70% of them are making marketing decisions on their own late at night with their credit cards. And what that means is there's probably a very significant opportunity for companies to come in, someone to come in and train them and hold their hands. This is not going to be an exclusive do-it-yourself operation. Google saw that very early on when they allowed do-it-yourself search engine keyword buys, and the churn rates were really, really high. What we've seen is Facebook has done a fairly good job of making the tools a little bit easier, making the reporting and the results a little bit easier, but you have a massive amount of local media sellers, 141,000 local on-the-ground advertising salespeople. Of those 141,000, the pure play companies employ about 6,000, maybe 6,400. Newspapers employ 21,000, radio employs 15,000. These are very influential people in local markets, and they're trying to supplement their declining legacy advertising with some digital advertising and exhibiting a fairly good level of expertise on how it all works and how it all puts together. So we do see a marrying up of a lot of these media companies with marketing tech companies, even with companies like Facebook, and just got off the phone the other day with another a mapping company that will go nameless that is working, trying to cultivate relationships with all of these local media sellers. So that's it. I just wanted to give a quick plug to our conference because we do have Randall Rothenberg as one of our keynote speakers. It's March the 12th and 13th at the Grand Hyatt. Would love for you to be there. It's a great conference. It's usually pretty close to sold out with about 400 people. It's the largest local digital advertising conference in the country. It's our 9th year, so hope you can attend. And Chris, I hope this was what you wanted.
Thanks, Gordon. Very much appreciated. There's a bit of finger fumbling to unmute, so it's not that I had to think about my appreciation. That was great. Thank you so much. We're now going to move into the questions phase. We've got a lot of great questions. We're going to get ourselves a bit collated here, and then we'll read them out loud and answer them. All right, so the first set of questions we're going to go through, several have come in around largely the same theme. The question many will be asking once this is reported, how much of the growth is attributed to Google and Facebook? Questions about what share of the local SMB spend Google and Facebook are getting. These are your questions that these are the kinds of things we need to understand better. I know Gordon had some local data in his deck, but again, we need to, this is part of our march forward, is to better understand this, to map it out better. We in this report don't speak about companies specifically, but building a structure to understand these dollar flows is important. And so that's where we're going to be moving forward. In terms of year-over-year change, we have a question about in regards to local and SMB. No, we don't have that at this point in terms of year-over-year growth change. This is all part of our what we need to understand better. You have another question about the IAB's own plans to focus on small and medium-sized businesses, launching new initiatives. I will say this subject is going to be talked about and sort of fit into a larger framework at ALM in February. We encourage everyone to join us there because we're just beginning to understand this and folding this into our plans moving forward. Another question coming in, under which advertising format does the survey incorporate native advertising? I'm going to kick that over to David, who can answer that one.
Sure. So we've surveyed to try and break out native as its own category. Unfortunately, we're unable to get, I think, enough response to have a meaningful breakout on it. But we do acknowledge that native is within the survey. It's largely in display, but it could also be within the subsets of the display. It could be within banner, which I think primarily, and video as well.
Cool. Finally, we had a question come in about why are CPMs up? Does this have to do with more quality inventory, access through private marketplaces? We don't have the whys in this particular context. We have organizing the what is where we're focused here. So I'm going to punt on that one because I don't have a good answer. Looking to see if there's any. I think we can take up if press if you have questions. I think you can direct them to Laura and we can follow up that way. Members, please give Christina an email. We're happy to talk and clarify what we can and be clear about what we can't. So thank you, everyone. Much appreciation to David Silverman and PwC. Much appreciation to Gordon Burrell and Burrell Associates. And thank you to all for spending some time with us. And we look forward to next time. Thank you.